if we want to have politicians and our elected officials talking about new Silicon Valley ecosystems, then their policies have to be nimble enough and open enough to allow these entrepreneurs to benefit from their procurement processes to keep them alive. Come and play. I mean, it's solar. Don't tell anybody how good the consulates are in terms of bringing people together.
Tell me the story of David. What brought you to this point?
Well, I think the best way to start was with the way my kindergarten teacher explained to my mother that I would always have my finger in every pie. I found that 20 years later in a drawer, but I think that sort of sets the stage for my life, which is that I've been in transportation and water and development, civic life, public affairs, in clean and green technology, an anti-silo person. I'm interested in things bumping into each other, which means that Los Angeles is a perfect petri dish for me. Because here we have 150 languages, second largest populations of many countries outside of their capital city. It's chaos for many people. For me, it's like a perfect playing field for bringing people together and seeing the synergies that come out of that. So if you ask me the thread, that's the thread.
So you've had this history in business. Can you tell us about how that's kind of transformed?
Yeah, well, I would say that this firm, which is my firm, which has been in existence for about 35 years, is essentially a boutique consulting firm that allows me to pick and choose the clients in the fields I play in, play an economic role with those players until they're sold or until they morph into something else. I much prefer adhocracy, where it's just 2 or 3 key people and we put together teams to accomplish things, or I join a board or invest in a company and I'm part of that company as a seasoned advisor. So I need the private sector, but I'm very attuned and interested in the private sector as the driver of the markets that I'm in. I'm out in the field. I also publish. I'm a journalist. I even have a press pass. Not everybody thinks it's real, but it is a real press pass issued by the police department. And it allows me to publish every month on interesting people and platforms and to live a life of a journalist looking to how to connect dots and who those people are. So I run a business that isn't like a hierarchy siloed firm. It's a very entrepreneurial firm.
What are the kinds of things that you're working on, and what are the kinds of things that you're doing?
Well, in this late phase of my life, I'm deeply involved with clean and green technologies, energy and clean and green technology, mostly because, as I've explained often the last couple of years, my son transitioned from a green communist to a green capitalist. When he was doing that transition, I realized I needed to keep up with him. I hadn't kept up with him when he was a teenager. I hated his music and he despised mine. And so I had an opportunity, having sold some businesses, to choose what I wanted to do 9 years ago. And I figured, let's put together a global platform where we could bring together what's in market, about to be in market, and needed in market, in the way of technologies and clean and green technology. I happen to live in California, which is a major driver of that globally and is a major procurer of that. So I happen to find myself in the right location, and I'm deeply involved in holding those events, publishing and investing in some of those companies for the last 9 years.
Organizations like yours are typically, you're really driven by some sort of larger concept cause. What is it that drives you to continue to be involved in this green tech field?
Right. I can answer that in a couple different ways. I gave you one answer, which is really personal, which is I wanted a deep connection to a son I adore and respect. But I'm also knowledgeable enough about public policy and process to realize in this community, especially so large, so diffuse, that procurement of those technologies could become quite political because people didn't know what was going on. It was hard to find out what was in market, about to be in market, and what the best in the world were. So I thought, let's raise the bar. Let's make it hard to do the stupid things. let's see if we could bring the best talent around the globe here, put people together for a day in which they could begin to appreciate what their alternatives were. And I figured that would be a positive step forward. And I've always been sort of a 1960s reformer, but I'm not a Stalinist, so I believe you want the market to send the signals, but the markets depend on information. So we thought this would be a strategic way of doing that, so that's one of my missions.
In the past, there seemed to be less listening to the consumer. I feel like we're going into this stage where, governments, political parties, brands, they're really being forced to listen to people. What is the market saying? What are you hearing?
Well, that's a very perceptive comment, and it's very true in the worlds that I'm engaged in. There's no doubt that in the digital age, the consumer drives the markets. And so the technologies that are passing through our conference that I'm very attuned to are technologies that give information to the consumer, which drives the markets. So you're absolutely right. In fact, it's overthrowing older, siloed, hierarchical markets. In the energy market, even in the water markets, which are glacial in change, are being forced to adapt to the consumers having choices. So you're well taken point. That's what's happening. And devices and apps and the cloud that can bring information to the consumer on their iPhone or whatever are scaring the hell out of the older institutions. I want to make one other point. When I started Verde Exchange, I started with a partnership of a global media company that does, among other things, published newsletters at offices all over the world, does Apple World and Mac World. They put around me a bunch of branding people to help me figure out how to brand this thing. And most of them were trying to learn from us about clean and green technology because they wanted the business. But they didn't really know about it, and they didn't really care about it. They just wanted to understand the buzzwords that would allow them to grow their branding business. I think it's changed now. I think people are beginning to see the applications, and I think it didn't work. Greenwashing didn't work. So again, the branding marketing people are adapting to the fact that their consumers that they're interested in know a lot more than the branding people.
So these consumers, the general population that tend to have a much more heightened awareness to some of these issues as before, what kinds of things are they saying? What are they asking for?
Well, I'll give you the answer my son gave me when he was explaining this to me. He said, "Dad, it's like entertainment on demand. It's energy on demand." If you think the utilities which dominate this conversation 9-10 years ago, they're not responsive on demand. And my generation wants in their iPhone or in their computer, they want it when they want it, and they want it how they want it. So that's the dynamic that's driving this thing. And so on demand. It's I teach for 10 years, one class a semester in the spring at UC San Diego. And my son TA'd for me in the early days and said, all those students have their computers open, sitting around you in a U-shaped thing. They're really doing Google and email. They're not listening to you. They're managing their own education. And so you have to adjust. You can't just lecture to them. You have to engage with them because you're, again, getting signals from them and you have to be responsive. So I think this whole demand response thing is so different than it was the way I grew up and the institutions I grew up with. And you're on the cutting edge. If you can get the consumer's voice and get them connected and engaged, they will drive the damn market.
So what does that mean for brands?
I'm invested in a technology that's about to become quite public, but it's a device that will manage your energy in your home. It's connected home is the general category. But our brand benchmark is Nest, which is like an Apple product. What do people tell us? It's got to be cool. It's got to look cool. It's got to be cool. And it's got to meet a need the consumer has. Not that some academic has said would work or a policy person. It's got to meet a need and it's got to be cool. And so I'm the old guy on the board, but I'm listening, and those are the messages. It's got to be cool.
What about on the public policy side?
You know, the public policy side's interesting. I've spent a life in the public policy side. There are basically two approaches. There's what I'll call a Stalinistic central government approach, which if you're lucky, and California's been lucky, has had strong leaders, quite intelligent and imaginative, and they've put in place a bunch of top-down policies that they set a low bar and then they ratchet up every 2 years in terms of goals. And you have to meet those goals, and that will allow you into the market, and they will grant you benefits and whatever. And it's worked quite well in California. New York has a more market-driven thing. How do we put in place in policies incentives to drive good behavior and disincentives to wash out bad behaviors? So they're more market-sensitive. California is more, here's our goals, you have to meet those goals, and we'll just keep ratcheting up those goals. Both have worked. New York is surprisingly working, and California is now a decade into it and has to be viewed as a leader in clean and green technologies and in public policies that reduce pollutants and greenhouse gas. But we have such a far way to go. We're going to have to live with these experiments for quite a long time, and the markets will definitely respond to either one of those policies. Some are better, some are faster.
Yeah.
But innovation and technology are not a hallmark of the public sector. They're not iterative. And so my leaning is, because the private sector and the nonprofit sector are more nimble, they actually learn to survive. You just want to provide some incentives and say, okay, how would you do it? And then how would you get better at doing it? I think that's a better way to do it. But it's a tricky deal.
Do you think it needs to stay state by state?
Well, we're going to go into a Paris meeting in December. But it's very hard. There's so many different points of view and interests in the economies that I think we've found the last couple of years that some tremendous things are going on if you give focus to subnational efforts. We've been showcasing the Quebec-California relationship, which is now going to be Ontario and Quebec and California. We just had some wonderful events with the Aussies at the Council Journals here in LA about water and linking Victoria and California and other markets, learning how you went through your drought to iteratively teach us how to go through ours. So I think those combinations are easier to manage and demonstrate and show than trying to get national consensus or global consensus right at the moment. And maybe that's the way it should work when you don't know the definitive answer.
Certainly there's forums where conversations can take place. Right. Whether they lead to any sort of change, I guess is probably something you can answer.
Well, you know, when you say that last phrase, I want to come back at you with that last phrase. I mean, you're showing, show me that it's making a difference.
Yeah.
But you're saying it as most consumers, and certainly most people engaged in their civic life, pay so little attention to it, and they're not really interested in a detailed proof. Just look at Los Angeles. The air in the last 20 years here is dramatically better. We had a Beijing problem and stories about it. And today, you're experiencing, as we do this interview, a great day. We have fewer and fewer days of pollution. We have dramatically, through a series of reforms and policies and investments, made a crucial difference. People thought of Los Angeles as a car-dominated culture. We're building the largest 12 lines of public transport right now with a vote of $30 to $40 billion of sales tax, about to put on a $100 billion sales tax measure to reinvest in that public transportation system. It takes a long time. If you look at it as like a ship captain, 1 or 2 degrees change takes you a different continent, and you have the time to take that trip, it's material. If you're waiting for the next 4 hours in the news cycle, it's very hard to prove. Usually when I occasionally get into a debate about clean and green technology with somebody who's denying climate change, I say, forget it, I don't even need to argue with you. It's a $3 trillion economy. Come and play. I mean, it's solar and wind and geothermal and water technologies. And I mean, it's incredible. It's imaginative. You're going from NASA and JPL to a sanitation system to reform it. It's about infrastructure. It's about your life. It's about your kids. Play with it. Forget the global policy arguments and just understand that just to report today that wind in India has just surpassed solar as a new source of energy, and it started from zero. So it's a global economy, and it's just so fascinating. I mean, I started almost from a zero. I didn't grow up in the environmental movement. I grew up in civil rights and other sectors, but wow, when I discovered this because of my son, I thank him every day. It's the most interesting stuff I've ever worked on.
What role does Verde Exchange play in that?
It's a platform. It's a cross-platform, what we call a business-to-business conference that attracts a global audience of players in energy and water and transport and finance and green build over 2.5 days with a lot of social time at dinners, at consulates and others where people can interact with one another. You can find out, as I said, what's in market, about to be market, and needed in market. But more than that, you can have a drink with them and have dinner with them and follow up with them. And you can cross the platforms in all these social settings because the solar people can meet the real estate people, can meet the finance people, can meet the water people, can meet the microgrid people, and all the regulators are meeting the private sector people. And I think relationships and appreciation for opportunity is a real incentive for making change.
What's your general observations on some of the change in the relationship that consumers and brands have?
If it's on your iPhone or the equivalent, you have a powerful voice in what's going to happen. So one of our startup companies we invested in is finding consumers through social networking that are signing on to these devices outside of the institutional framework. And when they get to 5, 10, 15, 20, 25,000, they're a force, they're a city. That's outside of the frameworks of the public utilities. Sure. So we're not locked in anymore to our choices. And we're finding in the water business, as I shared with you, that like microgrids for electricity, which are outside of the utility frameworks, that are set up in a geographical area that are self-sufficient, and there are experiments of that all over the country. They're now becoming water microgrids, and people are trying to figure out how to become self-sufficient with water and utilities. We're all going to adjust. One of our major speakers who runs the California Independent System Operators, which controls all the private utilities on the stage this past January, said, if it isn't going to be on my iPhone, you're going to be irrelevant. Because they're going to want to control their energy bill, they're going to want to control their water bill, and if you think you can give them one choice and tell them what it's going to cost, you're going to be out of business in a decade.
How do these organizations or even these utility companies almost work together to kind of amplify the message if they really do want to become a whole lot more relevant?
They have to align themselves with the public regulators in terms of what they incent and disincent. And then they have to brand themselves with being on the right side, which is the consumer side. I think accept that climate change is an issue. And if they're aligned and if they're consumer-oriented, people will listen to them. They're going to have to adjust, though. Their business models, just like newspapers in Los Angeles have had to adjust, you're going to have to adjust. But I think you want to be on the cool side. You have to be with it. You can't fight it. If you're fighting it, I think too many consumers are going to turn their back on you.
What does that mean for entrepreneurs starting out?
Well, I've just spent quite a bit of time thinking about, and it's also part of our conference, is how do you create an innovative ecosystem? You have to have markets. You have to have a place people want to be, and that has opportunities for them. In other words, that ecosystem has to be rich with opportunities. And there have to be procurement and market strategies that encourage that. Most of our procurement strategies in California take years to go through, and no entrepreneur can survive that because their revenues don't hit positive for years and they couldn't afford to do it. So if we want to have politicians and our elected officials talking about new Silicon Valley ecosystems, then their policies have to be nimble enough and open enough to allow these entrepreneurs to benefit from their procurement processes, to keep them alive, to nurture them. I just finished reading an article Our first editor of one of my newsletters is the developer of the Cornell residential campus on Roosevelt Island in New York. It will be the tallest, greenest residential tower in the world. The groundbreaking was today, the day we're doing this interview. And the mayors were there, Bloomberg and de Blasio, and the president of Cornell announcing how proud they are of this. Well, there was a process in which the city of New York saying, what kind of cluster do we need to create? Deciding it was the commercialization of academia, looking for a site to do it, picking a dilapidated area in Roosevelt Island, putting a competition that pitted Stanford versus Cornell, getting $500 million of investment, and now breaking ground today to start a whole cluster that will attract scientists and in healthcare and medicine and energy to New York and keep those people in New York with opportunity. That's a strategy that I think consumers can understand, young people can understand, entrepreneurs can understand, and it's driven by public policy and private investment. Well, the origins of Silicon Valley are really the origins of a public-private partnership between Stanford and UC and entrepreneurs and some larger companies that took their profits and reinvested in these young companies in order to be on the cutting edge. And they created an ecosystem. We have in Los Angeles equivalent institutions, Caltech, USC, UCLA. You have equivalent institutions in Australia. You can find them in Berlin. You can find them in Toronto. But how do you put that ecosystem together with the universities, with the public policies, with the private sector, the financial sector, and then have a residential environment you want to be at? Of all the places you could live in a world in which you can live on an iPhone, I want to be there. That's what you have to create. And so regions where there are lots of people and there's lots of economic activity, and you can just throw your hat in the ring and do it, and then people give you another chance, you want to be in those places.
What do you say to investors who are interested in getting involved in it?
There are only two questions. Is it a good idea, and are these the people to do it? Those are essentially the two questions. So if I can find a 20 or 30-year-old that's a surrogate for my son with a good idea, and I can surround them with some very wise people that want to give them a little time and steer them, and you have enough in your portfolio that you don't live or die with any one of the ideas, because that's just unrealistic. I'm game. I think some of my friends are game too. But I think you can find right now quite a few people in this particular 2015, 2016 economy that if they found some people with some good ideas that maybe have been through an incubator or an accelerator, I think there are a bunch of ideas that are going to do quite well.